It could be argued that for almost every success Nintendo has had, there's also a sizable flop to match. The company is known for innovation to the point that whatever their competitors are doing, Nintendo seemingly does the opposite, and not always for the better. In the early 2000s, Nintendo attempted to merge the world of card collecting with video games, with an accessory for the Game Boy Advance known as the e-reader. Depending on where you live, you may know some or next to nothing about the e-reader. In Japan, it was wildly successful and spawned two different versions, the e-reader and e-reader Plus. What we got in North America and Europe was the Plus model, although it was simply dubbed the e-reader. I got my own e-reader for my birthday in 2002, and to this day, I still don't know a single other person who had one of these things. Needless to say, it wasn't successful in America and did even worse in Europe, where few were produced and it was pulled from shelves almost immediately. The e-reader is special for a variety of reasons, both in its capabilities and the neat games and cards produced for it. These same reasons are also why it failed to capture an audience outside of Japan and why it remains largely forgotten by many. The e-reader is massive. It's almost the size of a regular Game Boy Advance and all but eclipse the Game Boy Advance SP, especially when the SP is shut. It does fit just fine into your Game Boy player, though it jets out just as bad there as it does everywhere else. Its huge size meant it didn't work on the DS, but it does work on the DS Lite and even the Game Boy Micro, though it is missing some functionality on certain systems where it couldn't fully connect to the link cable slot. To call it bulky is an understatement, and frankly, that's part of why it failed. The Game Boy is meant to be small and portable, with games that fit inside the unit itself. The e-reader was a nightmare to travel with, and believe me, my younger self tried several times. Inside the e-reader is a special barcode scanner that reads the coding on each of the e-reader cards, dubbed dot codes. Dot codes typically line both the left and right sides of a single card, though some of the later Pokemon cards that contained dot codes had them on the bottom and one side, and even further were cards that only had one line of dot codes. Scanning cards is as simple as swiping a debit card at the gas station. Just load up the scan feature, wait until the game tells you to swipe, and slide a card through. Bigger games like the NES titles required multiple cards to fully scan the game. The e-reader is smart enough to know you've swiped the wrong side twice or swiped them out of order, which is pretty handy. Of course, the multiple card games are also numbered as well, making it easy to keep everything in order. Plus, they've got information about the game you're scanning, like how to play or tips and secrets. Nice touch. Cards were sold in packs, although unlike traditional trading cards, most card packs let you know what you were getting. For example, a pack of cards needed to play Donkey Kong contained 5 cards that needed to be scanned to play the game. There was no need to buy tons of the same cards to complete the set, thankfully, just the one pack designated for the game. NES games were the most widely available e-reader cards, though the games themselves were all traditional arcade affairs. You weren't about to get a more complex game like Zelda or Kirby out of them, but simpler games like Excitebike or Pinball. As you can tell, this is far from the ideal way to play these games. The resolution for each is stretched and squashed to match the Game Boy Advances, with many sprites looking pretty awful. The sound is actually good, at least as good as the original, and they control like they should too. The e-reader thankfully has a save function, so you can turn off your Game Boy and save the application you just scanned. Sadly, the e-reader can only hold one game or application at a time, so if you want to change or play something different, you'll have to scan all your cards again. NES titles were the biggest games for the e-reader, but they were far from the only. One of the most interesting released for the system was Mario Party E, an e-reader exclusive Mario Party game. Well, to call it a Mario Party game is a bit misleading, as it's more of a card game than it is Mario Party. E uses actual cards for everything, coins, stars, the whole 8 yards. There was also a terrible mat that was folded at least a dozen times, meaning when you needed to use it for the game, smoothing it out was next to impossible. But that's assuming anyone would want to play with you in the first place. Mario Party E had this strange power where it might intrigue your friends, but the second that mat and the instructions rolled out, suddenly Mario Party 4 sounded much better to them. That said, I've had this game for years, and despite reading the instructions, which do claim you can play alone, I've never really sussed out how to play it. The Mario Wiki has a pretty good write-up that tries as best they can to explain it, but honestly, it's the actual e-reader game cards that anyone cares about. And with that said, there's not much to say about the minigames in Mario Party E. Mario Party games are short and simple by their nature, but the ones from Mario Party E are even shorter and simpler than the standard Mario Party affair. In total, there are 11 cards with games, 2 of which are just roulettes that have players giving up coins or gaining stars, similar to the Chance Time minigames in the original Mario Party titles. 4 of these are meant to be played by one person and largely are just pressing the A button at the right time. The only exception to that rule is Daisy's rodeo game, which I'm not entirely convinced works properly. It takes longer to scan the cards than finish the actual games, and while some of the sprites are kinda neat, there's just not much to say here. The last 5, however, are called duel minigames and are intended to be played against another player. Now, this is interesting because obviously 2 people playing a single Game Boy at once isn't really feasible. Thus, these games are about getting the best score or time you can, then passing the system over to your friend and hoping they can't top it. These games are slightly more evolved than the single-player ones, which were dubbed free challenges, but still aren't particularly deep. All in all, Mario Party E was an interesting experiment, and of all properties to try to adapt for the e-reader, Mario Party does make the most sense. It's just the cumbersome and somewhat overbearing setup, plus, having the actual Mario Party games right there, that meant it wasn't about to sweep the nation. Unlike, say, Pokemon cards. Beginning in 2003, certain Pokemon cards were outfitted with the e-reader dot codes, with 2 different functions. The first were for cards with just 1 line of dot codes, which was to give information about the Pokemon on the card, similar to the Pokédex used in the Pokemon games. The second, and arguably more interesting, were minigames, not entirely dissimilar in both the sound design and depth to those seen in Mario Party E. The thing is, these games are even stranger. Some of them aren't games, so much as just animations that play. Something happens, you can rewatch it, and that's about it. Others are about guessing? Betting? I really don't know what's going on with this one of Dragonite flying around the world, but he does it a number of times, and then the game shows you what it is. That's it. It's random. But there are actual games here, which are largely based on Nintendo's old Game & Watch series, but with a Pokemon twist. Certain games and animations do repeat, however, just with different Pokemon swapped out. But as an addition, one they didn't necessarily need to have, they're pretty neat to see. In a sense, the e-reader was a precursor of sorts to DLC. Several games like Animal Crossing had cards one could buy and then scan, hooking up the e-reader and GBA with a link cable to the GameCube. The idea was that owning these cards could add a lot of functionality to your games, and easily, the one that really achieved this the most was Super Mario Advance 4. Mario Advance 4 was a port of Super Mario Bros. 3 from the Super Mario All-Stars collection on the Super Nintendo. Up to this point, Nintendo had been porting their Super Nintendo Mario titles on and off to the Game Boy Advance under the Super Mario Advance line of games. And while each one added an updated version of the Mario Bros. Arcade game, none of them offered big changes or features besides the necessary ones needed to make the game work on the GBA. Mario Advance 4, however, was different. In addition to all of Mario 3, there was a special e-world added, where players could use the 2 types of cards they collected. Item cards that would allow them to get additional power-ups, including ones that weren't native to the game, and level cards. The cape from Super Mario World, for instance, was my personal favorite and was by far the item I used the most. Others included extra lives, fire flowers, essentially every item that could be attained somewhere in the game. The new levels that could be scanned in from the level cards were surprising because not only are they pretty dang good Mario 3 levels, some of them are very challenging, like more than the end of the main game even. In total, including the handful of remade stages from Super Mario Bros. 1 and some of the PR exclusive cards, there is a total of 38 levels that were added to the eWorld and could be accessed by scanning these cards. Players could also scan their power-up cards mentioned earlier at almost any given time on the overworld, both in the main game and in the eWorld, which was actually loaded from a separate file entirely. Now, as great as this is, there were two major flaws with the e-reader Mario 3 cards. For starters, you'd need two Game Boy Advances in some capacity to scan these cards into your game. One running Mario Advance 4 and the other using the e-reader. If you had a buddy or a Game Boy player, that wasn't a huge deal, and in truth, is exactly what Nintendo was banking on. What was an issue, however, was the availability of these cards. See, the e-reader was a big success in Japan, as we stated earlier, but North America had hardly any love for the e-reader. And since its launch was in September 2002, and Mario 3 was a year later in October 2003, e-reader cards had become scarce at that point and very hard to come by. The Super Mario Advance 4 e-reader cards are notoriously rare and difficult to find due to their limited run. Many level cards never left Japan. It's worth noting that all the information for games with e-reader capabilities were included within the games themselves, meaning titles like Pokemon Fire Red, Animal Crossing, and of course Super Mario Advance 4 could be accessed by hacking or cheat devices like an Action Replay. Thus, for years, the only true way to play all Super Mario Advance 4 had to offer was through ROM hacking. Nintendo actually rectified this in 2016 with an eShop release of Super Mario Advance 4 on the Wii U, which included every single level, even the Japanese ones, unlocked from the get-go in the game's eWorld. Sadly, the item cards weren't implemented in any way, but certain levels do allow you to obtain the cape at least, but only in the eWorld, not the main game. Still, if you want to experience these levels in a largely complete and working fashion, this would be the best way to do it, except it means playing a Wii U, so, you know. Wanting to marry video games and card collecting isn't a totally bad idea. Nintendo had major success just a few years prior with Pokemon cards, which still sell well to this very day. When you also consider how huge the e-reader was in Japan, it just makes sense from a business standpoint. For the reasons listed earlier though, the e-reader was very counterintuitive to the whole point of the Game Boy, to take it with you wherever you go. Having to bring extra cards plus this massive attachment meant the convenience of the Game Boy was taking a back seat to a gimmick. The e-reader may have been better suited as a GameCube attachment in some capacity, as keeping something like this at home would be far easier to manage, especially for kids. But by 2004, the e-reader was largely phased out in North America and gone completely in Europe, to the point that special e-reader functions present in the Japanese versions of Pokemon Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald are missing entirely from the versions released throughout the rest of the world. Nintendo hasn't been the only company to toy with bringing physical cards and video games together either, and even then, the idea of selling physical media that can also optionally be added to your game in some capacity is still something they're doing today. Amiibos took the world by storm towards the end of 2014, with sales and demand skyrocketing through the roof. Figures continue to come out today, but even Nintendo themselves seems to view them more as collectibles, since Amiibo support has quietly been featured less and less in more recent Switch titles. But if nothing else, we wouldn't have those golden Mario Amiibos to trample each other over for if we didn't first have impossible to find e-reader cards.